Maybe it is to Bishop Sheng more than anyone that I owe my restoration to a more normal state. The little older than myself, he talked to me like a father and gradually made me take a firmer grip upon the normal circumstances of everyday life. Eventually the Japanese, who had overrun Shanxi, were reported to be on their way to Shanxi, so followed from Xian to Boachi. A short while before this had been a small village, then with the influx of refugees it had grown like a mushroom into a huge city. From here I went to Fengxian to Mr. and Mrs. Fisher again, and with them worked among the refugees and the surrounding villages. While there I was invited to take part in a conference of young people and speak to them about pioneer work. When I arrived at their headquarters I discovered that this group was actually from Kaifeng. They had been students in the school there but had been driven out by the enemy. Many of the students had scattered, but about 60 of them had determined to keep together and study when they could. They had carried along with them benches and books and various other things from the college, and had studied while they trekked. Now they had reached Fengxian. I did not give the lectures because I became ill again. I lay in bed, weak and full of doubts. Why had God allowed me to come here among strangers, all for nothing? One day I heard murmurs coming from the next room. It sounded as if people were praying. I crept out of bed, threw on my outer garment and slippers, and slipped out to investigate. Peeping in the open doorway I saw about 15 students squatting around what was obviously a map. Then one went forward, shut his eyes and poked with his finger at the map, much as I had often done as a child when we had played a game of putting on the donkey's tail. When he opened his eyes, he read aloud the name of the place where his finger had landed, and said, "Does anyone know anything about this place?" I stood entranced while one after another prayed about this unknown town or village. Then another went forward again, jabbed blindly with his finger, and read another name. At the end of the meeting, I questioned the students and learned that they had this part of the Northwest laid on their hearts and were praying for different places every day. For 3 weeks I stayed there, in bed most of the time. Then at another of these strange prayer meetings I said, "Is anyone going to these places you are praying for? Nobody is free. We have not finished our studies. We have no money and no one knows the country, but now our special prayer is for someone to go and spy out the land." 2 days later I was convinced that God was asking me to go to this unknown territory. I offered myself to this group of earnest, loving young Christians and, with their prayers and blessings ringing in my ears, I set off a few days later. The countryside was beautiful and for the first few days my leisurely journey was very pleasant. A cold converse with those I met, but I knew before long the language would prove a difficulty. As I went farther into the northwest I managed each morning to get someone to escort me as my guide from his village to the next until I came to St. Sui. I stayed a night or two with friendly Christian people, but when I asked about the road ahead, with one accord everyone advised me to turn back. "You cannot go further," they declared. "This is the end. Further on there is nothing." "But the world doesn't just end like that," I argued. "I must go on. It is what I have come for." The villagers shook their heads dolefully. They were sure by now that I must be a little strange. Then, seeing I was fully determined to go forward, a Chinese doctor offered to accompany me for 5 days. His name was Dr. Huang, and he had always been curious as to what lay outside his immediate district. Dr. Huang was a Christian, though maybe up to that time not very deeply taught. But he could read and, as we traveled, we talked and sometimes argued. When I could not convince him, I handed him my Bible and he could read the passage in question for himself. The 5 days lengthened to 9. We went on and on, speaking to all whom we met, but not one of them had heard of Jesus Christ, the Son of the God in heaven. On the 10th day we came out onto a mountainside and that night had to stay in a filthy hut. The next day we plodded on all day but did not meet a living soul or see the slightest sign of human habitation anywhere. By mid-afternoon I was becoming perturbed. Where were we going to sleep? Where would we get any food? I was here alone with a man I knew very little about, and I needed company. I stared around and then burst out. Drive. Huang, we are going to put down our bundles and pray. We threw our bundles on the ground and knelt down. Dear God, I began, have mercy on us. You can see what a plight we are in. Give us food and shelter for the night. My whole prayer was taken up by my own wants, my own immediate requirements. Then very calmly Dr. Huang began to pray. Oh God, send us the one you want us to tell about Jesus. We have witnessed to no one today, but you have sent us here for some special purpose. Show us where to find the man you intend to bless. I felt humbled and ashamed. While I had been so concerned with my own comfort, this man was concerned only with his Father's business. After a few moments I said, shall we sing a chorus? So we sat and sang, and our voices must have carried far in the clear mountain air. Suddenly Dr. Huang jumped to his feet. There is our man, he cried. And before I could stop him, he had dashed off. I sat alone, feeling very small and frail in this lonely barren country. Finally I saw 2 little specks in the mountainside. As he drew nearer, Dr. Huang kept shouting, come on up, I have found our man. But I sat stolidly on. To me there seemed no sense in scrambling up that steep, rock-strewn hillside. Eventually Dr. Huang reached me and said, God obviously means us to go up, so come along. But what about our bundles? Leave them. There's no one here to steal them. Half carried and half pushed, I scrambled up and found, leaning against a rock, a Tibetan Lama priest. I stared from him to Dr. Huang. I knew that lamas were supposed to have nothing to do with women, also that outwardly they appeared to be holy men, but inwardly many of them were bad, immoral, ignorant and superstitious. Did you tell him I was a woman? I demanded of Dr. Huang. Yes, but he invited you to come to spend the night in the Missionary. I hesitated. What were we letting ourselves in for? Why should Tibetan priests invite me into their sacred buildings? There is nowhere else for us to go, Dr. Huang pointed out. Suddenly the man spoke and, although his accent was strange, I could understand what he said. We have waited long for you to tell us about the God who loves. My heart jumped and, without another word, we followed our guide up the path. Then we reached the Missionary and I caught my breath at the beauty of the scene. The side of the mountain which we had climbed was barren, yellow and rocky, but on this side, because there was water, the mountain was covered in rich green grass and lovely flowering vines. And at the top stood the Missionary, imposing and stately. As we approached, my fears returned. The huge gate closed as we went in, and I thought, we are in, but will we ever get out again? A party of lamas greeted us almost reverently and escorted me to a small room. The men padded backward and forward, bringing everything they could think of for my comfort, tiger rugs, cushions, water for washing, and dish after dish of daintily prepared food. It seemed like a dream. After our strenuous climb, I felt very weary. I had just decided I would lie down to rest when women knocked at the door and politely requested me to accompany them. I was joined by Dr. Huang, and we were escorted through one courtyard after another until we came to a very large one. In this were 500 hassocks made of coconut leaves ranged in a rough semicircle, and on each of these hassocks sat a lama with his hands piously crossed and his head bent. We were taken to 2 empty hassocks in the center, and sat down. What on earth are we expected to do? I wondered nervously. Dr. Huang said, "Now we will begin. You sing." "But what shall I sing?" "Anything." So in a very trembling voice I sang in Chinese the American chorus, "Glorious Freedom." A deathly silence followed. Then Dr. Huang began to talk. He told them about the baby who was born in a stable in Bethlehem. Then he told them of the Savior who died on Calvary. "Now sing again," he said. So I sang, then I talked, I sang again, then he talked, I sang again, then he talked. Still the 500 lamas sat immobile on their hassocks. We could not see their faces, but why did they not speak or make a move to end this meeting, which looked as if it might go on all night? I was on the verge of collapse, so I said in a low voice, "I will fall off this hassock in a minute. Then we will finish," Dr. Huang replied. And rising, we sailed out of the great hall. Later we discovered that as guests we must be the first to move. Politeness demanded that our audience sat still as long as we sat. Again I started to go to bed, but was disturbed by a knock on the door. 2 priests stood outside. "Woman, are you too tired to tell us more?" they asked humbly. "Are you allowed to come into my room?" "Yes, if there are 2 of us." They came in, they listened intently, and they went away. A few minutes later 2 more came, and so it went on all night. Always the same question: "Will you explain how and why he died? Will you explain how is he could love me?" These men never questioned that God was the creator of the world. They never doubted the fact of virgin birth. They did not consider any of the miracles incredible. To them it was the wonder of God's love which obsessed them. The story of Christ's death on Calvary filled their minds with awe and reverence. The next morning, when the priests were gathered in their temple, Dr. Huang and I had the opportunity of comparing notes, and I found that the same thing had happened in his room. Here, indeed, were men thirsting for the old story of God's wonderful plan of salvation. We decided we would stay a little longer. We stayed a week, and all that time, whenever the men were free from their duties, they came and asked for more. At last we decided we must leave the following day, so we announced that for the last night we would gladly talk to those who wanted to visit us. That evening I received a summons to go before head Lama whom we had not seen so far. Dr. Huang was not invited. I was to go alone. The ordinary lamas were a kind of Chinese border race, but I imagined the head of such a large Lamasery would surely be a true Tibetan, and I wondered how we would overcome the language difficulty. I found a fine-looking man, seated on a beautiful cushion, with servants attending him. To my amazement he addressed me in the pure Mandarin Chinese of Peking, which I understood perfectly. We discussed various things, then greatly daring, I said, "Why did you let me, a foreign woman, come into your Lamasery? Why did you allow me to speak to your priests?" "It is a long story. Out on our mountainside grows a licorice herb which my lamas collect and sell in cities. One year the men who had taken the herb harvest down on the mules were passing through a village when they saw a man waving a paper while he called out, "Who wants one? Salvation free and for nothing. He who believes gets salvation and lives forever." If you want to learn more of this, come to the Gospel Hall. The lamas, utterly astounded at such a doctrine, took the tract and brought it back to the Missionary. He was then shown the tract, now worn and in pieces, stuck on the wall. It was a perfectly ordinary tract, simply quoting John 3:16, "For God so loved the world, that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life." That was all, but from it they had learned that somewhere there was a God who loved. Everybody read it and reread it or had it read to them. The head lama continued the story after I had read that important scrap of paper. The next year, when our men took the herb down to the cities, they were told to find out where the God who loved lived, but for 5 years they could learn nothing more. Then the man who had first received the tract vowed he would not come back until he learned more about this God. They went on and on until they came to Lenchao. There they saw an important-looking man on the street, and asked their usual question, "Can you tell us where the God who loves lives?" "Oh, yes," he said. "Go down that street, and you will come to a large gateway with 3 signs over it. Faith, Hope, Charity. Go in there, they will tell you about God." Jubilantly they approached the small China Inland Mission Station and asked the same question of the Chinese evangelist. He told them all he could, then gave them each a copy of the Gospels. Eagerly they hurried back to the Missionary, and we read the accounts of Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. We believed all that it contained, though there was much we could not understand. But one verse seemed of special importance. Christ had said, "Go ye into all the world and preach the gospel." So obviously one day someone would come to tell us more about this wonderful God. All we had to do was to wait and, when God sent a messenger, to be ready to receive him. For another 3 years we waited. Then 2 lamas, out on the hillside gathering sticks, heard someone singing. "Those are the messengers are waiting for," they said. "Only people who know God will sing." While one went back to tell the rest of us to prepare for the long-expected guests, the other came down to meet you on the hillside. That was why everything was done for our comfort, why they gladly clambered down and brought up poor bundles, why they received us with hungry hearts. We did not ask these men if they were saved. I do not know if they came out from the Missionary. I had preached his gospel in this place that God had appointed. I left the rest to him in the work of the Holy Spirit. I know the Missionary stands on that beautiful hillside now, for the communists destroyed it and drove away all its inmates. What happened to those 500 lamas, I often wonder. That many of them believed, trusted and received salvation, I have no shadow of doubt. God had prepared the soil. Dr. Huang and I were proud to be used as his messengers. Only in eternity will we ever learn the result of one of the strangest weeks I have ever spent. 14 After leaving the Missionary there was no other course open to me but to turn back. Dr. Huang had said 5 days. We had already been away 17, and he had a wife and children at home. I could not go alone in such a desolate, uninhabited country, so we returned to Sensui, witnessing to everyone we met on the road. From there I made my way back to Fengxian to tell the students how wonderfully God had answered their prayers. Sometime later I was forced to go to a town of which I knew nothing at all. All I possessed was a ragged gown I had been given, and I felt utterly disappointed and puzzled. Why had God sent me to this strange city with no money? It was a huge city filled with students. What was there for me here? I was taken in by a Chinese doctor and his wife and treated with great kindness. I was sitting in a room in their house when I became conscious that two men behind me were talking about some place and city where there were people who had never heard of Jesus Christ. Completely forgetting my manners, I burst out, "Surely, sirs, you must be mistaken. There are churches all over the city, there are meetings everywhere, there are hundreds of Christians. Madam, you must be a stranger to our city. I have been here only 2 days." We were talking of the prison. "Is there a prison here?" "Why, the second biggest prison in China is here, and no one has ever been in there to tell the poor wretches of Jesus Christ." I talked further with them but was not particularly disturbed. After all, prison work had nothing to do with me. I had always preached in the villages and small towns, that was my work. But for the next few days I had no peace. God told me very definitely that whether I liked it or not, those men in the prison were my business. Every one of them had a soul for which Christ died, and I had come to China to proclaim that gospel wherever God led me. At the end of the week I sought an interview with the governor. He was exceedingly polite, but so patronizing that I became increasingly nervous. "What can I do for you, madam?" he asked, looking at me coldly. "Would you allow me to come into your prison and preach about Jesus Christ to your prisoners?" "You wish to come into the prison itself?" "Yes." "And what do you intend to do if I allow you to talk to the men?" "I intend to alter your prison." "Madam, I have been governor for 5 years, and I have not altered it in the slightest degree. But I have Jesus Christ. It is He who can bring about the alteration." I got my pass and I was escorted into the great prison courtyard. Rows and rows of horrible, dirty, cruel-faced, degraded men were lined up, with jailers at the end of each row. They were shouting, laughing and jeering. I was so small that a kind of little mound had to be built up for me to stand on. I talked to them, I told them stories, then they trotted off. Day after day I stood on that little mound, my heart hammering wildly, but with the knowledge of the terrible, desperate need of these men driving me and night after night I prayed for hours for them. Often when I should have been sleeping I was out on the hillside with the Christian leper, walking and praying, never daring to stop because he was unclean in body, but how truly clean in heart. Besides going into the prison I was visiting the leper camp, and I believe it was the prayers of the Christian lepers which strengthened me during those first terrible weeks in the prison. At last one prisoner was converted, then another, until I had 5 who would come and take their place beside me and testify to the change God had brought about in their lives. This was wonderful. But prison certainly wasn't altered, and there were thousands still mocking at God's word. One day I had finished talking and was going out feeling hurt, tired and longing to get away from the awful stench of unclean humanity, when a gate opened and 4 men were dragged in. They were chained together, and were thrown violently on the ground by their guards, who stood over them with guns. My first thought was, get out of this as fast as you can. I hurried toward the gate when a voice said, "Gladys A, I died for these just as I did for you." I turned back to the guard. "Will you allow me to speak to these men?" Roughly, and in impolite language, the guard refused. I walked slowly around the courtyard, praying. Then I asked again. This time I received a curse for my answer, and the guard shouted, Throw this pestering woman out." I was put firmly out by the gateman. A few days later I learned that all 4 men were murderers. 3 were already dead, only one, Mr. Shan, was still alive. Mr. Shan was young, handsome and arrogant, but there was something about him I felt to be utterly evil. He looked at me in a horribly offensive fashion and said unrepeatable things. I disliked him intensely, but I prayed for him and I got my friends to pray for him. One day I tried to speak to him, but with an oath he turned and spat in my face, and I felt I almost hated him. The months went by, and now I had others helping me in the work. Other prisoners were converted and we had 40 in a class preparing for baptism. But still the blessing had not swept through the prison and changed it to any noticeable degree, but in the leper colony prayer went on incessantly. One day after I had finished speaking, the men formed into their lines to return to their cells. They always had to move at a trot, and not one could speak while moving. I stood watching them pass, my heart aching for them. By now I knew most of these men. I knew they were in this place and, though not allowed to speak, I could smile and nod. Way down the line I saw the man I disliked so much, Mr. Shan, the man who seemed harder to move than the prison walls themselves. Very clearly a voice said, "Speak to that man." "Oh, no," I replied. "He despises me." He actually spat at me. Besides, the law of the prison states I must not speak to him while the line is moving. Nevertheless, you must speak to him. What was I to do? A cold sweat broke over me. He was almost up to me. I was so agitated that I leaned forward and let my hand fall on his shoulder, while I burst out, "Oh, Mr. Shan, aren't you miserable?" Of all the stupid remarks, I thought immediately, with a horrible curse he threw off my hand. "What is it to do with you if I am miserable?" "Because I am so happy." "Of course you are. Doesn't the door open for you whenever you want to go out?" "Ah, that isn't the reason. It is because Jesus Christ died for me." Mr. Shan passed on, and I realized the awful thing I had done. One of China's greatest unwritten laws is that no woman touches a man in public. I left that prison depressed and ashamed. Before those men I had defiled myself, and with such a man as Mr. Shan. Mr. Shan followed the line and sat on a stone in an inner courtyard, his head bowed in his hands. A few moments later, Tukor, the first man who had been converted in the prison, saw him sitting there. "Are you going to be ill?" he asked, staring at him closely. "Did you see what she did?" "What?" "She touched me." "No. That is a lie." "It is no lie. She put her hand on my shoulder." "I cannot believe it." Another prisoner who had been listening joined in. "What he says is true. She did touch him." "She touched me as if she loved me." Mr. Shan gasped. "Perhaps she does love you," Tukor replied. "What, a clean woman like her love me, a murderer, who has cursed her and spat at her?" "Yes, I believe she could, because she believes that God loves you no matter what you have done." Mr. Shan was converted, not because of a great sermon, but because years ago in London God had taken a girl and asked her to give him her hands, her feet, her whole body for his use, and that day God had touched Mr. Shan through that poor human instrument. Mr. Shan's conversion began the real revival in that prison. Men spent hours listening to the Word of God, they spent hours on their knees, and we had baptisms which lasted 3 days. Testimonies, especially that of Mr. Shan, were printed in the prison press, and before long calls came in from other prisons to come and do the same as had been done here. The governor himself, convinced by the alteration in even the most hardened criminals, was converted, and proclaimed in no uncertain fashion that what he had been unable to do in 5 years, the power of the glorious gospel of salvation had accomplished in 1.15, even unto death. While the work at the leper colony and the prison was going on, I heard that the Methodist Church was advertising for an evangelist who could deal with the great crowds of refugees who were pouring into the city, most of whom came, like myself, from the north. I applied for this job, but stipulated that I should be allowed to carry on my work in the prison and upper camp. This was agreed, and I went to live in a room at the back of the church. During all these months 1 or 2 of my children were usually with me, but only the older ones who could look after themselves. I was glad of their companionship, and it was good to feel that I had some sort of family life. The war had just ended, and most of the missionaries had gone home or were still in concentration camps. The need was so great, but the workers so few. There seemed to be a spiritual lethargy about this church to which I was now attached, which weighed on me heavily. The building itself was neglected and in a filthy condition. It was a large church, with a huge gallery, and one day I determined to go up there to see what it contained. I found that, like the temple in Nehemiah's day, it had been used as a storeroom. It was full of old junk, and everywhere there was rubbish, dirt and cobwebs. As I stood looking over the balcony, feeling discouraged and depressed, the sun suddenly came in at dusty window. A shaft of golden light struck the cross on the communion table, and as I looked I saw the Lord stand there looking up at me. As I gazed, he spoke. "Prepare this place for me, for I intend to bless." Leaning further forward, I said, "O Lord, how long?" 40 days, came back the reply, and gradually the vision faded. I knelt down, my heart throbbing with reverence and awe. I truly believed that in 40 days blessing would come, but before that I had to work and pray. I resolved that every day I would wash and clean as much of the church as I could, and when I had cleaned it I would pray in that part. For some time I had not been well, and some Christian friends had arranged that I should go away with them for a rest and vacation. I began my cleaning and praying, but I told no one of my vision and my resolve. As the time drew near for my proposed vacation, I grew perturbed. Only a few of the 40 days had passed. How could I disobey my Lord's commands? I decided to tell our Chinese pastor, Christian Shang, about it. He did not ridicule my story but immediately agreed to join me in the task. I went to see the friends with whom I was to go on vacation and found that they had completely forgotten the arrangement and their promise. They felt most embarrassed and were deeply apologetic. He almost shouted, "Hallelujah!" The Lord had overruled even in this small detail. I could stay on until blessing came. As Christian Shang and I were working in the church one day, Gordon, one of my adopted sons, came to look for me. He, too, joined in the scrubbing and praying. A few days later the treasurer of the church, Chen Tsung, found us, and last a converted bandit joined our work party. So now 5 of us spent every available minute washing, cleaning and praying. By the end of the 40 days the church was spotless and we had prayed in every part of it. But we knew that if we were to have blessing we must work outside too, so we decided we would have special gospel campaigns, and during the following months we were wonderfully blessed. About this time we had a request from the Youth for Christ organization to hold a campaign. They would pay all expenses if we could supply the workers. By now we had a band of keen converts who gladly did whatever was necessary, and we had a church fit to be used. Bob Pierce, an American, was the evangelist, and Dr. Allenbrigge, the interpreter. And because the ground had been prepared by incessant, earnest prayer, the blessing swept through the city. Hundreds were truly converted, including many university students. For several months we continued in glorious blessing. It almost seemed that we had gone back to the days of the early church, but we know now that God was strengthening us and preparing us for the terrible days that were to lie ahead for all of us, young and old alike. The Communist Party took complete control of the university, and to each of the 500 students was handed a long form on which was a series of questions to be answered truthfully. I managed to get hold of one of these forms and, because I wanted to understand just what they involved, I tried to fill it in. Some of the questions were awkward, some seemingly irrelevant and utterly ridiculous, such as, do you know what your grandmother died of? How many children did your uncle have? How much money did your grandfather have when he died? There was no mention of religion, no mention of a political party, but right at the end, when one was tired and confused, came the all-important question. What position are you in? If for the government, put a circle, if against, put an X. This was the question which meant either compliance with all the authorities decreed or future unpleasantness. If one put an X, it would mean he would be outside the party, he would have no job, he would be poor, he would be an outcast. Almost all of those 500 students had started their education in Christian schools. If they had been ill, they had gone to Christian hospitals, because all that was good in health and education had come to the isolated districts of China through the missions. Also, many had been converted during the recent campaigns. When the 500 forms were counted, 300 had put circles, 200 had put an X. The communists looked grave. They called together the 300 who had signed agreement with those in power, and told them that there was work for them to do. They could use what methods they liked except that of actually taking life, to force those 200 into line. For the next month the most horrible forms of teasing, petty cruelty and unpleasant irritations went in. Then the forms were handed out again. But to the utter amazement of the authorities, were fewer circles and more X's. How had this happened? They began to make urgent inquiries, and they learned that every morning the Christian students had held prayer meetings. In the university the lectures began at 9 o'clock. All the students lived in the campus, and at 8 they went to breakfast. But at 7 the Christians had gathered in groups for prayer and Bible reading in order to gain strength for the day of testing they knew lay before them. When the non-Christians had discovered this, they had broken up the group and caused pandemonium. So the Christians gathered at 6 o'clock. Again their opponents discovered them, so they rose even earlier and met at 5 o'clock. So it went on, until by the end of the month some of the Christians were getting hardly any sleep. The authorities took immediate action. We'll stop all this congregating together. We'll put an end to all this prayer and Bible reading. They announced. Each Christian was isolated and put under the guard of 10 red-hot communists for 3 months. Their every movement was watched, and night and day they were talked at, jeered at, indoctrinated. We watched these poor isolated Christians getting paler, thinner and more haggard. There was no way of contacting them, and we trembled for them. They were young in years and many of them only babes in the Christian faith, but all we could do was pray for them that their faith would not fail in spite of all the fiery darts of the wicked one. At the end of the 3 months we were all forced to appear in the market square. Under a huge squad of communist police we saw the 200 students marched into the square. In a witness box stood Amin with a list of names. He called out the first. A girl of 17 stepped forward. She was refined and beautiful, and had been brought up in any of those lovely courtyards that belonged to the wealthy of Peking before the war. She had been sent here for safety. Now she stood before her accusers. "What position are you standing in now?" bellowed the voice of the man in the box. She walked to the little platform. She faltered a little and we thought she was going to fall. Why put a slim, frail slip of a girl up first? We questioned. Poor child, how can she stand? Then her voice rang out, suddenly clear and strong. "Sir, when I went for my 3 months indoctrination I thought Jesus Christ was real. I thought the Bible was true. Now I know Jesus Christ is real, I know this book is true." One after the other of those 200 names were called out, and not one faltered, though they knew enough of their persecutors by now to know that they would be made to suffer. Every one of them was beheaded that very day in the marketplace. Before each execution the victim was given one last chance to recant, but even those at the end, who had been forced to watch the terrible butchery of all the others, did not flinch. Why, people ask, did God allow it? Was it because he loved them so much that he took them before worse terrors and tortures befell them? Theirs, maybe, was the easier death. They went straight off those many mansions their Savior had gone before to prepare for them. They had followed him even unto death. 16 Back to England. For a long time I had been oppressed with the feeling that I ought to return to England. It had been 20 years since I left, and long ago I had decided that it was unlikely I would ever return. I was Chinese enough in name, in dress, even, in some ways, in thought, and I loved my adopted race. I was needed here, and it had never occurred to me that England needed evangelists maybe even more than China. After the great blessing in the Methodist Church and in the prison, the newly converted held many prayer meetings. They felt led to pray for definite things. And if one Christian had a specific need on his heart, he voiced it and they prayed on and on about it. One day I was attending one of these prayer meetings when a young man stated that he felt very definite and earnest prayer was needed for England. At the end I took this young man aside and asked why I had brought the subject before the Christians. "Do you think England needs praying for?" he asked. "Yes, but not as if it is a heathen land, because, after all, it is a Christian country." "But are they having blessing and revival?" "I do not know. They can't be. If they were we would know it, in the midst of all our famine, war and suffering. England, the land that sent us the gospel, is worshipping other gods." "What do you mean?" "To them sport, film stars, wealth, amusement, all are far more important than God." "But how do you know all this?" "From the papers. I will bring you some to prove it." A little later he handed me a bundle of Chinese papers, and when I read them I understood the burden of his prayers. Every item of reported news from England, every picture, was concerned with a film star, or a sportsman, or a horse race, not one mention of God. England, seemingly so prosperous while other countries passed through terrible suffering at the hands of communist domination, had forgotten what was important, the realization that God mattered in the life of a nation no less than in that of an individual. From that time I knew that I must go back to the land of my birth. I must return to do what I could to dispel the spiritual lethargy that had overtaken so many. I must testify to the great faith of the China Church. I must let people know what great things God had done for me. Some months later I applied for a permit, but the quota was full, so I had to wait a whole year before I could apply again. By that time things were getting very hot. I knew I was under suspicion, and I set for Shanghai. I had no money and no clothes, but I knew of a society that might help me. This society was composed of a few godly Chinese who had banded together to help the destitute German missionaries. During the Second World War these Germans had suffered terribly. They could receive no help from Germany and, of course, got no help from the English because they were enemies. At the end of the war this society paid the passage home to Germany for those who were able to go, but many had died of starvation and disease. To these Chinese Christians I owe the fact that I ever set foot in England again. I had gone to China with very little except youthful determination. I came back, middle-aged, with absolutely nothing but the knowledge that God had never failed me. Maybe I would find many things strange and difficult, but if God had worked for me here, He would supply all that was necessary and lead me a step at a time. 171 When I returned to Britain after an absence of over 20 years I felt almost as foreign as I had felt when I first went to China. I had taken Chinese nationality years ago, I wore Chinese dress, I ate Chinese food. I even thought as Chinese people think. I came back to a Britain very different from the one I had left, a war-scarred country, with a carelessness concerning morals that shocked me. Here in this land with churches or chapels in almost every street, with thousands of ministers, there was a terrible apathy. I had watched hundreds of Chinese Christians, who only a few years ago had been needle worshippers, suffer terrible privations, even torture and death for their faith. How would our so-called Christian land react if the communist clergy attacked it? Even in the churches themselves, the Christians appeared lukewarm. The women were dressed in the height of fashion, and social events were of much greater importance than the prayer meeting or the spread of the gospel message. It was far harder to reach the hearts of an English congregation than those of ignorant, heathen Chinese. I could not go back to China because of communist persecution, but how often I longed for the uncomplicated life we had lived in Yanchang before war and the powers of evil had swept across me adopted country. But I felt God had brought me back for a purpose, and before long He opened up many avenues of service. I had requests from Christian groups all over the country to tell my story. This entailed traveling hundreds of miles, which I did not mind, and writing scores of letters which I hated. I found, too, that there were many Chinese people in England, and I realized how lonely they must feel in this strange country. I spoke their language and wore their dress and, like them, had to report to the police as an alien. I began to seek them out. There were scores in London and, in time, we formed a small Chinese Christian church. We had a Chinese worker who met the ships as they came from Hong Kong and Singapore, and we did our best to make the Chinese sailors welcome. Through them I got news of me beloved, unhappy China, and sometimes had messages smuggled through from some of my children. And, oh, the joy of knowing that even under communist domination the seeds that had been sown in their hearts had been uncrushed. Jesus Christ was still there all in all. In Bristol and Liverpool I found Chinese in great numbers, and I had the joy of leading some of them to Christ and witnessing their baptism. I had been asked to visit Ireland several times, but I had not felt led to accept the invitation. Yet more requests came in, and I felt that for some reason the Lord wanted me to visit Belfast. When the boat drew in, I noticed a police inspector and 2 constables come aboard. A few minutes later a steward approached me and asked me to go to the captain's cabin. There I found the police contingent. "Madam, the inspector has been informed that a foreign alien is on this ship, but the only person answering to that description is yourself," the captain said half apologetically. I laughed, then explained that I was English but had been in China as a missionary for over 20 years. Now, driven out by the communists, I was back in my native land. But, as I had taken on China's nationality, I was regarded as an alien. "Rather an awkward situation," the inspector said, stroking his chin. "What have I to put on the form? A little English lady, dressed in Chinese clothes, coming to speak in a church? Nothing we can hold you for in that, is there?" I laughed again. "I've been in prison in Russia and in China, so I guess an Irish one won't be so bad." The men grinned in friendly fashion. Then the inspector said jovially, "Well, as I can take you to prison, how about allowing us to drive you to where you are staying?" "I'll be very grateful," I replied with an inward sigh of relief that things had gone so easily. I drove in state to my host's house. As I shook hands with the inspector, he said, "Now, if there is anything at all I can do for you while you are in our city, don't hesitate to let me know." I thanked him, but felt that there was little likelihood of my needing police protection here. The next day as I walked down the street I met a Chinese girl. We greeted each other like sisters, and he talked to her for a long time and invited her to the meetings I was having. "Are there any other Chinese in this town?" I asked as we were about to part. "Yes, 3 others," she replied. "Can you give me their addresses so that I can visit them?" I asked. She wrote down the information, then added, "There is one more Chinese woman here, but you won't be interested in her as she is in the mental asylum." We said farewell and I went on my way. At the first opportunity I would visit these other people, but, of course, the one in the asylum did not concern me. I went to my room and knelt to pray, but something seemed to hinder me. Then quite clearly a voice said to me, "That woman you heard about is your concern. That is why I brought you to Ireland." I went downstairs and asked my host how I could get in touch with the patient in an asylum. He replied that he had a friend who had access to the place as he was on its board of managers. The friend kindly offered to drive me to the asylum the next day, and to inform the matron as to why we're coming. Just before I had left home I had received a parcel, and in it had been a Chinese mooncake. I put it into my bag when we left to visit the asylum. I was introduced to the matron, who handed me over to a nurse. She took me into a room and said she would bring the woman I wished to see. Then she said a strange thing. "Miss Aylward, I believe this woman is as sane as you or I. You will be doing God's work if you can help her." At that moment a nurse half dragged in one of the saddest specimens of Chinese womanhood I had ever seen, thin, frightened, cringing like a whipped dog. I spoke to her in Chinese, but she did not raise her eyes. I tried to tell her I wanted to help her, but still there was no response. Then, on impulse, I took the mooncake from my bag and slipped it into her hand. She stared at it, and a queer, strangled gasp came from her lips. "A mooncake," she said in Chinese. Then she looked at me and I smiled. "Wang Kuai, I want to help you," I said. "I too am Chinese now. Can you tell me how you got here? Tell me how I can help you." She stared at me a long time, then from her pocket she pulled a bundle of letters. "Can you read?" she whispered. I nodded. "From my son, but I cannot read them," she said in a tragic little voice. I opened one and read it, a simple little letter from a dutiful son begging his mother to tell him where she was and why he had heard nothing from her. Long before I had finished, Wang Kuai was trembling, then sobbing in a quiet, hopeless sort of way. I let her cry for a while, then I said gently, "Now tell me how you got here and I will write to your son for you." So by degrees the story came out. She had been engaged in China by an Irish captain and his wife to act as nurse to their 2 small children, and had come home with them. Then they had left her with the children in the home of the captain's mother while they went visiting in England. The old grandmother was a bigoted Irish woman who hated all foreigners, looking on them as spies and fifth columnists. She could not speak Chinese, and Wang Kuai could not speak English, so before long trouble started. Wang Kuai said the grandmother used to fly into terrible rages and one day set on Wang Kuai, who tried to defend herself. The grandmother immediately sent for the police and declared that this Chinese devil was a raving lunatic and had attacked her. She dare not keep her in the house a moment longer. Poor Wang Kuai could not understand what was being said, but the sight of the police terrified her. When they took hold of her to take her away, she screamed and kicked in frenzied terror. There was noone to speak for her, no one could understand her, so she was put into the asylum, and proved tremendously useful as a sweeping woman. For months she had stayed there, a lonely, sad, bewildered little creature. Then I began the struggle to get her released, and suddenly I remembered the promise of my policy inspector. He could surely help in this matter. And he was as good as his word. He even found out that her employer was chargeable for her return fare to Hong Kong, as only on that undertaking was he allowed to bring her from China. I had to make myself personally responsible for Mrs. Wang's conduct and sign numerous papers, but at last she was free, and I could take her home to England to my flat where my friend Rosemary and I could treat her once more as a human being. And how she blossomed under our care and love. We never preached at her, but she listened to our prayers and loved to hear me read the Bible stories in Chinese. Then one day she came with her face glowing. "I wed, there is peace in here, because now Jesus is here," she said, pressing her hand to her breast. And my own heart sang for her as I looked at her. What a change from the miserable little stray I had first seen. A few days later Mrs. Wang returned with another Chinese woman, Mrs. Cheng, whom she had met in the street. "I must tell her about my Jesus," she said. And as she puttered about in the kitchen I could hear her explaining in her own simple fashion about the wonderful things that Jesus had done for her. A few days before Christmas Mrs. Cheng accepted the Savior, and together those 2 little women set out to work for their Lord wherever they could meet a fellow countryman. Asterisk. At that time I was feeling very tired after a long series of meetings. Mrs. Rosemary Briscoe, who had provided a home for me and had worked very hard also for the cause of China, agreed wholeheartedly when I suggested that we should have a quiet Christmas for once. Just Rosemary, myself and Wang Kuai. Wang Kuai laughed when I repeated my suggestion in Chinese. She had come to know our house but knew it was seldom quiet. The next day Rosemary said, "I have been thinking about poor Mrs. Ching. She's all alone. We could ask her for Christmas Day, couldn't we? Our little chicken will stretch to 4. That evening Peter, a Chinese boy who is very shy, came to see me. "What are you doing for Christmas, Peter?" I asked. "Well, nothing," he replied. I looked at Rosemary and I could read the words, "My poor little chicken," in her eyes, but she nodded. "Then spend Christmas with us, Peter," and his shy brown eyes lit up. Before he left, Alan, a French boy who had recently been converted, arrived, and somehow before we left Alan had also been added to our guests. Early the next morning there was a telegram from Jane, the Chinese girl in Ireland who had first told me about Wong Kwai being in the mental home. Jane asked if she could come for Christmas and duly arrived the next day. "My poor little chicken," Rosemary sighed. "It is getting smaller and smaller." Wong Kwai, however, laughed gaily, thrilled at the thought of her first Christmas as a Christian spent among so many of her own country folk. On Christmas Eve the bell rang and Wong Kwai, who loved answering the door, rushed to open it. We heard her voice rise in joyful surprise, and I translated for Rosemary. "She says the boys have come," I whispered. "What boys is she talking about?" Wong Kwai rushed into the room, her face beaming, and behind her stood 3 smiling Chinese youths. "The boys have come," chanted Wong Kwai. "The boys have come from Hong Kong." The boys came forward and bowed low to each of us in turn. Then one who seemed to be the leader explained, "There are 16 in our party. We are all students, boys and girls, from Hong Kong." Just before the ship landed one of the passengers explained that tomorrow is Christmas. All the shops will close and the colleges will not be open, so we did not know what to do. Then one boy remembered that before we left home, a young man had said to him that if he was in difficulty in England go to one of these addresses. He handed me a piece of paper and I saw that one address was in Leeds, one in Manchester, the other was my own. "We 3 came to find you, the rest stayed with the luggage," the leader explained. "We must see what we can do," I said, and Rosemary and I began to plan ways and means. It was impossible for us to provide beds, but not far away there was a hostel that might rake them in. I went over and found the landlady willing to have them to sleep, but she could not provide food at such short notice. So our family had swollen with a vengeance, and even the next morning some others were added. Rosemary's single quote's poor little chicken was smothered in great bowls of rice, and Wong Kwai, in her element, spent the day cooking pot after pot of Chinese food. Our quiet Christmas was only a dream. I can't even remember tasting a piece of chicken, for all guests finally numbered 27. But what did food matter compared with the great happiness that packed our little home that day, and the blessing of God that followed. Soon after this Mrs. Wong decided that there was work for her at home. "My son does not know about Jesus," she said. "My aunt who lives up on the hill has not heard of him. I must go back and tell them, and many others too." So Mrs. Wong left us, and how much we missed her happy helpful presence. Weeks later we received a letter from her son together with a beautiful gown for myself. He was full of thanks for all we had done for his mother, and said she wished him to say that she still had peace and was telling everyone about her wonderful Jesus. 18 an old suit. After I had been back in England a short while, I began to remember all the Chinese who had practically nothing to wear. Hundreds had been driven from their homes and had crowded into free China. Many had left the mainland and gone to Formosa or other islands. They were herded together in far worse conditions than our farm animals. Even in organized refugee camps the food was meager, and there were a few extra clothes to be doled out when the rags that had been worn for months dropped off. I looked at the English people, wrapped up in their warm winter clothes in spite of clothing coupons and utility material. I saw no one in desperate need of either food or clothing. In fact, there was far less hardship than there had been when I left England years ago, for at that time we had great lines of unemployed, and many men, women and children were undernourished and ill-clad. As I traveled around speaking in various churches, I told of the desperate plight of many of the Chinese Christians. And before long, parcels of outgrown or discarded clothing came pouring in. I was sharing a home in London with my dear friend, Mrs. Rosemary Briscoe. Once our small house had been part of the mews belonging to the large homes of Society Grandees who had their London houses in Bryanston Square. Now the mews were no longer needed, so the stables were turned into very cozy little apartments, each with its own small garage. We had no car, so the garage was the storeroom for the second-hand garments we received. Rosemary was a lady by birth and had a very different education and background from my own, but she made no fuss about sorting out the conglomeration of stuff which we collected each week. She could not preach and had never been to China, but she loved the Chinese who visited us and was just as interested as I in every aspect of the work. While I was attending meetings up and down the country, Rosemary would be busy sorting out, washing, mending and packing such things as were suitable to send abroad. It wasn't a spectacular job, but we'll never know how much comfort it brought to those poor homeless people. Just before the big Christmas postal rush, we sent off 15 parcels weighing 25 pounds each to a Norwegian lady missionary who is working in a huge refugee camp just outside the communist territory. As always, when the consignment of parcels arrived and before they were opened, the missionary arranged a special prayer meeting so that they might pray for guidance in the distribution of these clothes. That evening the missionary met a Christian Chinese merchant who told her he traveled between Hong Kong and Macau with his goods. "Are there many refugees in Macau?" she inquired. "The place is absolutely packed with them," was the reply. "Is there any Christian work being done among them?" "No one is allowed to do anything because Macau belongs to the Portuguese." "Will you take one of these parcels and pray that you will be guided to give the clothes to those most in need?" So, with one of the unopened bundles, the merchant set off for Macau. He had a room in the town, and he went straight to it to leave his belongings. Then he decided to go out to buy some food. Coming down the street he met a man who looked ill and starved, yet carried himself proudly in spite of the fact that all he wore on his emaciated body were a sleeveless waistcoat and a pair of ladies' panties. The merchant stared, then gasped. This man had once been one of China's most prominent men. "Sir, are you looking for lodgings?" the merchant asked diffidently. The stranger shook his head. "Would you come and eat with me?" went on the merchant. "Thank you, I accept," was the dignified reply. Together they went to a small eating house and the merchant ordered a simple meal. "I recognized you as you came down the street," the merchant remarked as the meal progressed. Is there anything I can do to help you? I believe you are a Christian. Will you pray with me? The merchant bowed his head, and very simply the nobleman said, O Lord, thank you for answering the first two parts of my prayer. You have brought me to safety, you have given me something to eat. Now please answer the third part and give me something to wear so that I can get employment and so keep my self-respect. I believe God has answered that prayer already. The merchant said eagerly, Come home with me now. Together they opened the bundle which we had sent from London with our loving prayers, and there, right on top, lay something which had very seldom come into our hands, a man's complete suit. Often we had odd jackets or odd trousers, but practically never a matching suit. Weeks later we received a letter from Macau, bearing the signature of a man who had been one of China's wealthiest and most influential men before the communists came into power and robbed him of home, money and family. In that letter were many grateful thanks for the clothes he had received and through which he had been able to gain employment. Now he was hoping to save a little money so he could help his wife and family to escape and join him once more. He told how he, a prominent Buddhist, had been stripped of all he possessed, then thrown into prison. But it was there he had come to know Jesus Christ as his Savior and Lord. He had lost all in this world, but he had peace and joy in his heart because he was a Christian, and nothing the enemy could do could take that from him. It was letters such as this one, and a deep longing in my heart to see some of my children again, which made me determined to leave the comfortable, safe shores of England and go once more to share the hazards of the people I loved so much. I could not return to Communist China, but I could go to Formosa and Hong Kong, and many of my loved ones had escaped to these places. I felt I had finished my work in Britain. I had traveled far and wide telling of the sufferings of the Chinese Christians, and now I wanted to tell the gospel story once more in places where it was no easy thing to be a Christian. I was getting older and felt that the years I had left had to be given to my Chinese people. When I arrived I was given a wonderful welcome, how different from that first time I landed on Ms. Lawson's doorstep in Yanqing. What a joy it was to be met by many of my children, now grown up and with families of their own, but still true to their Savior. And what a tremendous thrill it was to bosom into one audience with Madame Chiang Kai-shek herself, and to be thanked by her publicly for what I had done for the children of China. The conditions under which many of the nationalist Chinese were living horrified me, and the sufferings which many of the refugees had undergone almost broke my heart. There was so much work to do, and I had so little with which to do it. With a handful of other Christians I began a mission in the refugee area of Hong Kong, and an orphanage near Taipei, but there was no money for even the necessities. Then came frequent calls from America to go and tell Christians there of the work, and eventually I felt that this was what God would have me do. Of my own choice I would have preferred to stay with my loved ones and share their privations, but it seemed that by going to America I could help in a more practical way. Churches in many parts offered me the use of their pulpits, and promised support. So once more I set out for a strange country, knowing little of its customs or its people, but from the first they took me to their hearts, and never have I spoken to more appreciative audiences. And again God has proved that if we trust Him He will provide. For the organization known as World Vision Incorporated has undertaken by faith to supply money for the support of the mission in Hong Kong and the orphanage near Taipei. My heart is full of praise that one so insignificant, uneducated and ordinary in every way could boast to His glory and for the blessing of His people in poor persecuted China. Tables, carriage garages and living quarters built around a court or street or yard.